So I wanted to give just a little background on some of the work that we've been doing here at Western, just to bring it back to the Gunnison Valley, give us a perspective on some small pieces of research that we are doing here, and again, bring it back to that conversation of other places that we might go. So as a bit of background, as Corey mentioned in the very beginning, and she and I both teach in the Master in Environmental Management program here at Western, and which has a bit of a different opportunity, I think, for students and for faculty in terms of research and engagement, and really crossing a bridge between the two and thinking about research as it informs practice and as it informs management practices, such as we're talking about today. And our collaboration in winter recreation study really began in 2015 when Silent Tracks approached me with questions about understanding winter recreation in the Crested Butte area. And we brought in this, oh, there they are, very serious team of research students. This was my environmental management class in fall of 2015. And they took on this question of, what could be done to better understand winter recreation in the valley, particularly on the northern end of the valley. And after working for the whole semester on the issue and exploring it from many perspectives, many entry points, the students came away with two primary recommendations. Their first was to engage more stakeholders, and their second was to gather more information. And this was despite the fact that one of the first things that I teach my students in my environmental policy class is that very few management or governance decisions are actually based on data. But they still saw the importance of data, and I'll concede the point that this may be changing here. This is a report from 2017. This was a collaborative report that a bipartisan act supported by both Paul Ryan and President Obama. And they commissioned a report on how the US government could more effectively use data in decision making. And the quotes summarizing their findings and their conclusion that in an age when our data capabilities are so robust, we could do much more to use data to inform management decisions. So here the quote, the American people want a government that solves problems. This requires that decision makers have good information to guide their choices about how current programs and policies are working and how they can be improved. Improved access to data can lead to an increase in both the quantity and quality of evidence to inform important program and policy decisions. And I would argue that locally, our land managers and our government decision makers are eager to have better data to inform their governance. And our students here at Western are ready to develop these kinds of data collection plans, organize field work, conduct the analysis as part of our service to the community and the work that we aim to do to create a more just and sustainable places to live in Gunnison and beyond. So in my time with the MEM program, I found many graduate students, some of whom are here today, who are eager to do just that type of work. And as one example, this is one of our first graduate students in the MEM program, Brian Lieberman, who initiated a project in partnership with the Bureau of Land Management and the Crested Butte Land Trust to study recreation use in the Slate River area, and particularly the Obi-Joyful drainage. And so he did this incredible summer of field work where he was out on the trail every single day. He was talking to people. He was looking, he had traffic counters looking at use and numbers, and compiled this really robust collection of data about what was happening in the Obi-Joyful area, and then shared it with his community partners in the Bureau of Land Management. And the work that he did actually has informed the decisions that you've seen happening over the last couple years in terms of putting in some camping limitations in the Obi-Joyful area, creating a fee structure, and bringing in some practices to actually materialize his work on the landscape. So again, at a very small scale, but really digging down into what's happening in a particular place and collecting information that directly informs management decisions. And so, being the wise professor that I am, I'm a wise park ranger, but I'm also a wise professor, I immediately turned to Brian Lieberman when we started talking about increasing our winter research and asked him to help us think through what we could do to design a winter management project like unto what he had done in the Slate River area. So that moves us into another phase from 2017 to 2018, where we've been conducting some preliminary work and then a little bit more robust study of who our recreation users are in the Crested Butte drainages. So we engaged Brian Lieberman to do the initial research design and planning with us, and then he turned the project over to Doug Shaw, who did our first kind of full season of data collection last year, last fall, or last late winter into early spring. He graduated in May and has handed it off now, and we have another student, Kendall Cox, who is going to continue that project through the winter. And just as a sense of scale here, we didn't talk about funding that went on for their project, but we've been funded by the town of Crested Butte and by our stakeholder groups, and particularly by community members who are giving money to this project, which I think is tremendous evidence of your investment in understanding what's happening in recreation here and really having some good data to inform our planning processes. So I think it's pretty cool the way that we're engaging students and bringing them into this project. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that Doug did. I can provide, if anyone is interested, his full robust data set. I can provide lots of charts and graphs. We're very happy to share that information with you. But for the sake of all of our attention spans at 8 o'clock at night, I'm going to just breeze through a few key points tonight. So this shows the locations that Doug was working in. So we tried to capture all of the major use drainages in Crested Butte. We actually expanded that beyond the initial places that we thought we would focus. But you can see that he was trying to capture trailhead data at these different areas and used multiple locations on some of the drainages that were a little bit harder to capture. And his method was basic. We were using an image capture and then analyzing the images and just tallying data. So this is a really rudimentary data collection method. I'm just trying to get some preliminary understanding of what's happening out there. So we used images. We used cameras that were capturing images, motion sensor cameras. You can see one here posted just on a post there, trying to capture images of recreation, but also I have a cute fox. There's a cute fox in my image here. So that shows the camera set up, and then this is what the camera is capturing across the way. Here's a cute fox walking by that camera. But of course, mostly we were looking at visitor and human users of these trails. And so every couple days, Doug would go out, he would switch the data card in the camera, he would bring all of those images back, and he would sit at his computer and pull up all of those images and analyze them. So there's a lot of problems when it comes to image capture that you may not anticipate. For example, all of you very fast snowmobilers out there can go buy a camera faster than a cold camera can warm up enough to take your image as you're going by. So we got a lot of images like this where you see the roost coming out behind, or you see tracks and have evidence that something came through, but you don't actually know what came through. And then of course, while you're working in winter, you're dealing with conditions that often fogged or clouded, and you end up with some mysterious snow creature walking through on the image. So even though these are our image capture methods, they're not necessarily perfect still in capturing what's happening there. And so we collect the images, you go through and analyze them, and basically then do a tallying system. And Doug was looking at different types of user groups, which, as you can imagine, becomes pretty complicated. We have a lot of different types of users, and how do you categorize them, and how do you manage them in ways that generate useful data. So we have everything from our fat bike users to several different types of snow machines, converted side-by-sides, grooming machines, geo-trackers that have wheels on them, and hybrid users, and all sorts there. And so we have a really sophisticated tallying system here where we used a bunch of clickers and tried to tally up images for each trail head, or each one of these says, what, it's a snow bike here, or UTV. So we're tallying up those users. And that produces a really big, fancy spreadsheet with a lot of data points on it. So just, you can see this, again, a small sample. This is the Slate River drainage for a couple weeks, late December to early January. We did record snowfall, trying to correlate some of the snowfall. This might have been like the last snow we got that year, 1225. And then each of these is the category, right, of what your users are. So if it's someone who's walking, if it's a fat bike, a hybrid user, and then this lovely unknown catch-all at the end. So just a raw data set cataloged by different user group on the different day as they traveled through or from the trailhead. And then there's several things you can do with this. So here's a totals page that just shows kind of what we saw over the whole course of the winter. Again, being the first year, we were trying to get this data out. The collection days varied considerably. We had pretty good comprehensive data from Washington Gulch and Kebler Pass, or at Slate River, and it took a lot longer to try to get cameras set up and everything calibrated. And so some of our drainages, we have a lot less data. So this would just be your total of motorized, mechanized, and non-motorized users by totals and by averages per day at each of the different drainages. So one example of kind of what you can do with that type of data to understand who's out there on any given day. And then Doug did a whole series, and again, I'm very happy to share these, sort of showing that data in a couple different ways. This chart shows the point it out here better than I can on my small screen. So the snowfall here in blue, you have your mechanized use at the bottom in yellow, you have your motorized use in red, which for Kebler Pass, this would be anticipated, and then your non-motorized use in green. So one way of just separating out the motorized and non-motorized as well as the mechanized. And then another image here that actually divides it by user group, so you can see the same information for Kebler Pass, and now it's divided up into different, hybrid snowmobile is here, and side-by-side, and cars and trucks and things. So a couple different ways to kind of look at this data, but this shows you some of the playing around that we did. Another point is that we did field test these cameras. So we went out and we had some students who actually sat there for several hours one day and actually looked at what was happening at the trailhead to try to get a sense of whether the cameras were capturing what was happening at the trailhead, if we were missing users, trying to understand who, to assure that our camera capture was working adequately. So we have pretty good reliability in most areas, a couple with some confusing parts, and we've taken that into account as we've designed and made modifications for this year. So just real quick, a couple kind of insights from this data. Again, most of this is raw data. We're not dealing with a lot of sophisticated data analysis at this point in time. But there are some kind of fun things that you can point out that maybe would inform how we think about travel management. So here's the chart, or the graph of the Brush Creek area for last year. And who can tell me what's happening right here? That would be the Grand Traverse. So all of a sudden you have this one weekend where all of your non-motorized users spikes really off the chart this year. It was last year, right, that it went out and back the same way, so you're doubling your numbers, like really crazy numbers. But then you can see what that does is that you're trying to look at your data point over the whole course of the winter. And we can adjust for that sort of from a data perspective. When we take out that outlier, you can see a lot more happening on the landscape. But from a management perspective, I think it's worth considering, are you managing for this type of average use, or are you managing for your full range? Are you managing for that one weekend when suddenly you have hundreds of users in that same landscape? Another thing that we thought was interesting that came out of the data is that we found an inverse correlation to snowfall. You might think that you would expect to see more people out using trails on days when it snowed. But look, here's a snow day, here's a snow day, here's no snow, and you've got spikes in use all throughout there. So, thinking about what might cause that, is that because everyone goes to the resort on days when you have fresh powder, you go other places, you grudgingly use the backcountry on days when the powder is not as fresh, or where you're going there to find fresh powder because there's no longer powder at the ski resort. But an interesting correlation. When we presented this data to the CB Town Council last year, they suggested that it might be worth correlating with avalanche data. Might be another data point that we could take in to look at some of the, are people making decisions about their backcountry use based upon avalanche risk. And then I'll just talk for a moment about some of the limitations and what could be conceived as strengths in this particular method. For example, here you see an image of snowmobiles that we would assume are a commercial use, right? Like all the same snowmobile, they're traveling together. So having the exact images gives us the ability to do some differentiation between, are these commercial users, are these likely people who are coming from out of town and hiring a guide to take them out versus, the person who's commuting back and forth to Irwin on their snowmobile. So we can start to piece out some little bits of information that are kind of interesting, I think, from that, so we get a sense of the variety of users. I think a limitation is that we can't really understand some of the big questions that are facing us. Like we have an interest in parking lots. What's happening in our parking lots? What's happening, the stresses in that sort of launching off moment. And we can get these images of the parking lots, but really, understanding people's arrival and those, their experience in the parking lot. Some of that information really isn't captured. And of course, we have no sense of what happens once they leave the parking lot, as we saw in Liz's presentation earlier. There's this whole other world of what happens once people leave and head out onto the trail. And then I think it really doesn't begin to understand the questions that may be of most interest to us as we think about travel planning and that interaction between different types of users and what that experience is for them, what that means to them, what their actual recreation experience is out on the trail. And so we took some other approaches to address that. But before that, I have to show you the coolest image that we got off the cameras for those of you who live in the Brush Creek area. That's a mountain lion right there. So think about that when you're skiing in the dark. So we have these wonderful, I love this image here too, of just what that hybrid use looks like, right? We've got a fat bike going on, we've got someone with snowshoes, we've got some folks headed out into the backcountry, they've got their dog, like they're traveling together, right? We want to talk about conflict, but here's, look at this, multi-use family outing going on here. But how do we begin to understand what people are looking for, what their experiences are? And so we have paired this with a qualitative survey that we've been posting. Hopefully some of you have participated in this survey. But we've deployed the survey. We did it from March 20th to April 9th in 2017. We used our stakeholder groups to help share it and get it out to winter users. We advertised it in the newspapers and on local radio, and invited people just to join in, to respond, to share their perspectives on winter use. And so we administered 20 questions online, really focusing on those 4 categories, looking at types of use, amount of use, trends, and then some of what we've been talking about, desires, preferences, what people would like to see. So that first year, we got 313 responses. We felt pretty happy about that. And just to give you a taste of kind of some of the things we were looking at, here's a question, looking just basically where do you go and how often do you go there? So where are your favorite locations to recreate or access the backcountry, and then for each location specify how many times per season, so we can get this data about where people like to go as they self-identify it. What are their places that they like to go and how often do they go there? Some potential here, right, to start to piece apart local use and outside use and all sorts of fun things. Would you like to see any more of the following implemented at winter backcountry trailheads around the Crested Butte and Gunnison region? So we asked about, do you want more trash cans? Do you want more trailhead sign? Do you want more access to groomed trails? More drainages encouraging motorized access? More drainages encouraging human-powered access? And then ask people just to rate whether that would impact their experience in a positive way, they had no opinion, or it would detract from their experience. And then one more example. Oops. looking at a specific issue, right? So we could look at public transportation. If parking is an issue at trailheads, what would people's responses be towards having public transportation available to them? Would they use it? And if so, or if not, why or why not? Because I want to ski with my dog or something like that. So, and then I guess I do have one more example here, a couple more. One looking at this idea of shared values that we talked about. I think it becomes really clear when you start talking to people about why they recreate that they have a lot of the same motivations in doing it. That we saw some strong values that came through throughout the survey. And then finally, an example for the conversation today, perception of the winter travel management plan, just a summary statement we asked them to respond to. The current winter travel management plan user designations in the Gunnison National Forest surrounding Crested Butte is meeting the needs of backcountry users in Gunnison County. And then they responded on a range from I strongly agree to I strongly disagree or I'm not familiar. So some interesting data kind of looking at people's opinions and ideas and values around winter travel planning. And so just a quick thought on sort of where we might go with this and research directions. Of course, we've seen some examples of how you could really scale this up. This was pretty preliminary and looking at a very small scale, but we really tried to bring together some of that survey information along with some understanding of just who's out there and what was happening there. Resource that I'll point you toward, we've done some work with the Colorado Mountain Club, who has been, as Liz talked about, using some of the data and information on your smartphone so that you can track that information, and they've got an ongoing mapping project, the Powder project, that you can get online and think about that, or participate in some of those types of mapping projects that are happening. And then I think this broader question of, some things that we'd like to do with our research, we'd like to be able to sort of scale it down and figure out what kind of sample we'd need to get a statistically significant sample without having to look at thousands and thousands of images all winter. So we're really thinking about sort of efficiency questions there so that we could spend some of our effort looking at other research questions that might inform our travel planning a little bit more. So.